Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here today. For decades, the great Chickasaw and Choctaw nations waged a brutal, bloodthirsty war for hegemony that decimated the American Southeast in the 1700s. British and French traders flooded these pre-industrial communities with revolutionary new items like woven cloth and metal tools and firearms. Lust for these life-changing goods and the gun's ability to seize them fueled decades of violence between these two native peoples. By mid-century, tens of thousands on both sides had suffered death, torture, and enslavement at each other's hands. Entire communities ceased to exist. The region had once been home to the thriving metropolises and powerful states of the Mississippian Civilization. Now, it was home to bones, ruins, and traumatized survivors longing to escape the killing. Meanwhile, the great British and French empires were waging their own war to dominate the region in this time. And from the Europeans' perspective, indigenous peoples like the Chickasaw and the Choctaw served only as pawns for proxy wars and markets for early capitalist ventures. British merchants provided Chickasaw men with muskets, and French traders did the same for the Choctaw. And these savages became the foot soldiers in the glorious war for empire. In 1759, the Redcoats and their brave American subjects from the 13 colonies kicked the French out of North America, and in that exact same year, the Chickasaw and the Choctaw made peace. Traditional accounts in almost all United States history before the 1970s treat Native Americans as puppets in the hands of European actors. The Chickasaw and Choctaw case fits this perfectly. As soon as written records start for these two people, they are fighting. As soon as the French are kicked out, the fighting stops. So it seems to line up perfectly. The only thing that was happening was this European conflict. But in 2017, leading Choctaw expert Greg O'Brien published an article placing all responsibility for peace in Indigenous hands. He convincingly shows that these people negotiated independently of European influence to find lasting peace on their own terms for their own reasons. Well, scholars now no longer talk about Native Americans as these barbarians that John Wayne fights, and they're not, victims standing above a highway shedding a single tear. Yes, there is violence. Yes, there is tragedy and atrocity, but there is also agency. These people were faced with impossible choices, and they made decisions. And so stories like the peace between these peoples is a great way to bring Natives' agency into the spotlight. They seized the initiative. They made peace. They changed their destinies. It's empowering stuff. Not everything is empowering stuff. If we're going to acknowledge that they had the power and the agency to end the war when they did, we also have to acknowledge the power and agency they used in keeping the bloodshed going. Sometimes agency creates tragedy. Those who met in 1759 were not the first to try and end the fighting. There is a long tradition of diplomacy in this region, stretching back generations, but firearms changed that. And it creates a situation of survival through death. Because if that guy over there gets access to European weapons and your people don't, your people probably won't last to 2025. And so this creates a tension across countless indigenous communities. They knew they had to escape the cycles of mutually assured destruction, yet anyone who withdrew from the European system risked becoming a victim of everyone who remained in it. So Native Americans had to select paths that promised them the greatest chance of survival. And unlike in 1759, actors in the 1730s and 40s chose to move deeper into devastation. These people faced problems not that different from ours today. They lived in the aftermath of a horrible mass pandemic. They lived with economic instability. They had rampant inflation. They were surrounded by natural disasters and wars all over the place. And they all looked around and saw troubling circumstances just like we do. I mean, I think it's safe to say that most people in this country agree that things are not going great and haven't for a while. We might disagree on why that is. We disagree on the best case forward, but we agree things are not great, and because we passionately believe in a good, best way forward, we become divided because your way forward is not the same as mine. They're not that different. In the 1700s, they faced all these similar problems, and most of the people for this period decided that the costs of peace were greater than the costs of war. Those manufacturers called seductively. I've only really focused on the gun, but these other objects matter as well. You want to survive. You want your friends and families to live and have good lives. And that meant that these people did questionable things in the name of their own self-interest. That ultimately makes them just like anyone else. Well, not everyone was going to continue the war. Two headmen from each of these nations, Imayatabé of the Chickasaw and Red Shoes of the Choctaw, worked together to try and make peace for some of their people. In each of these communities, there was not a centralized government. They are confederacies. Each town has a lot of autonomy. Both of these men had their own towns that got tired of a lot of this that's going on. And so throughout the 1730s and 40s, for a bit over 15 years, the two of them tried to make peace for their respective towns. But as I said, sometimes agency creates tragedy. Red Shoes, in particular, causes a lot of problems within the Choctaw Nation because other Choctaw headmen start to become jealous and worried about his rising influence. And so in the 1740s, after these two men have been working for many years to try to find some solution, other Choctaws get tired of what Red Shoes is doing, while the French get tired of it. And those two factors come together and lead to the assassination of both of these men by Choctaws. It is other Native Americans who kill these men, assassinate them for trying to make the peace. This will spark a Choctaw Civil War, and it will lead to another dozen years of bloody violence between these two peoples. But they do make peace, as I said. They do finally end it. But why does it take so long? Part of that answer is from the Europeans. 100% there is blood on their hands. But Native agency is at play as well. Before the 1750s, there were not a majority of people in both nations who wanted the war to end. And as long as someone wants to keep fighting, we're gonna keep fighting. All of these people lived in a dangerous, chaotic, unprecedented era. Everyone wanted to find the best way forward, to preserve their lives, to preserve their communities in a world filled with existential crises. They had to find access to European weapons and goods and reliable allies to survive in this deadly world, and to find some way to maintain their freedom and independence simultaneously. With so much at stake, it's little wonder they turned to violence to solve the problems before it was too late, which ironically just made it worse. People having the power to make decisions and influence the events around them does not always mean they make choices that make the world a better, safer place. Power and agency enabled the Chickasaw and the Choctaw to end their decades-long war. It also gave them the choices that continued the killing. Are we so different?